I wondered if we could just start by locating our moment historically and how it compares to other kind of migration patterns.
It's a really good question because immigration policy has changed a lot, right? It is so much easier for people to move than it was, 200, 300 years ago. And so actually for a long period in human history, there wasn't really any immigration policy and there didn't need to be. Immigration has always been controversial when it happened, but there was so little of it. It was just these particular short moments. But people weren't routinely moving long distances. Most people kind of lived in this very local area just around, within a few miles of their home. And then all of that, of course, changed. So immigration then policy starts to come in kind of around like late 19th century, early 20th century. And it was really simple. You had so in 1905, they introduced an act here, and it's got 5 criteria, and it's things like must not be a lunatic or idiot. It's like the actual wording in the law. And so, the border officers would kind of look at people and decide whether they were a lunatic or an idiot. And that was that. And the state had no capacity really to do anything else, but it's become a lot more complicated as more people have wanted to move, and there's these kind of greater expectations on what the government should be able to do for us. We entered this realm where we now have sort of thousands of pages of regulations and guidance and working out, who are precisely the people, how do we define who is the brightest and best if we want the brightest and best, and all of this kind of stuff. So yeah, we are in a very different era from where we've been historically. I don't think it's going to go away. I think the next, it's very difficult to project what happens over the next 100 years or so, for obvious reasons. But I think we do, the world remains a very unequal place, and inequality is one of the major drivers of immigration. There's a lot of uncertainty about things like climate change. How much impact is that going to have? It's not necessarily, that again, very difficult to project. But I think it's sort of, there is no reason to think that the inequalities that drive immigration are going to go away. So I think this is going to be a hot topic for a long time.
And I suppose that kind of drives us into the kind of overwhelming or overarching question that we're trying to get into, which is, what is immigration policy for? And that's a very big, complicated question to unpack. But I wondered if we could just have a go at tackling that head on. What is immigration policy for, and what are the different nuances to it there?
Yeah, so this is the title of my book, which, but in less than 220 pages, I will give you the brief summary, which is basically immigration. The problem and the reason immigration policy is so difficult for governments is that it's for quite a few different things.
Yeah.
So governments are, there are economic goals, trying to use immigration to boost prosperity. There are humanitarian goals, if you're looking at refugees, for example, people who aren't safe in their countries of origin. There are sort of social and cultural goals. And the problem that governments face is that these goals can conflict. So I think often there's this sort of nice narrative that you hear that, well, this is just about political will, right? If people just had the political will, if government had the political will to implement this set of policies, everyone would be happy and trust would emerge. And I actually think that that's not true, because you get these trade-offs between the different objectives, and reasonable people are going to disagree about how to deal with that. So the classic example of this is looking at refugees. There's a tension between, on the one hand, the desire to treat refugees generously before and after arrival, welcome people who would be in danger in their country of origin, and then the economics of immigration, which actually the evidence suggests that refugees are not particularly economically beneficial. We're talking about people who often really struggle. They didn't always move by choice. They tend to have very low employment rates in high-income countries like the UK. If they are able to find work, it's often very low paid. And so over the course of their lifetimes, there's a significant cost to public finances, at least, of welcoming refugees. So that sets up a kind of tension between the humanitarian goals and the economic goals, and we see those kind of trade-offs everywhere in immigration policy, which makes it really hard and also makes it unstable, right? Because the next government comes along and says, oh, actually, I don't think you got that quite right. I'm going to shift the balance. The next guys come after, and after that, shift it back. So that, why we can never settle down.
Yes, there are also these nuances on it. So there's these different arguments at play. There's like moral obligation, humanitarian, international law, that you have to give sanctuary to people fleeing certain things. And then there's even the nuance you're talking about with, if it's even the correct measure, but the measure of like how economically impactful are people that you're taking in. And on one hand, refugees may not have a particularly productive relationship with the state, but then on the other hand, other immigrants really do. So immigrants tend to be largely younger, they tend to be in their 20s and 30s, and that has an immediate benefit to the economy. So there's a nuance there. And the thing that I've kind of had to really sit with, which has been interesting, is like when you have a political bias, and I'd say I probably do, I think I'm probably very pro-immigration, so you read through it and you're looking for things to be like, oh, I can take that argument, so you have this obligation to try and push it. But one of the points that you're making, I think this is a very nuanced, complicated picture. And also what you're saying seems to be that the different how we talk about immigrants. So maybe we could unpack that a bit. There's refugees, there's economic migrants, and also there's people who come for familial reasons. So what's the data saying on the biggest reasons people are coming to the UK kind of at the moment, and what's the complexity of that picture?
Yeah, so this is a really important point, and I think one of the big challenges in the debate is that when we talk about immigration, people often talk about it as if it's a single thing, right? And you can have more immigration or less immigration, and it's all sort of more or less the same. And actually, because we're talking really just about people here, people are very different. And so you have, one of the ways I think is probably most productive to separate it out is why people are coming. And so you've got people coming for work, and that tends to be actually a minority. We often also in the debate talk about as if this is all about work and kind of meeting economic needs, and that's actually not true. Most people are not coming on work visas, or at least as the kind of main worker. You also have people bringing their family members. You then got people coming for to join family members. So if a British citizen marries a non-citizen, then if they earn enough, they will be allowed to bring them to the country. So that's one of the most kind of controversial areas of policy. That again is not massive numbers. The biggest numbers coming in are actually international students, which tends not to be the group that people think about. When you think about a migrant, think about who that person might be, why they're coming. Actually, study has traditionally been one of the biggest categories. But those people go home, and then you've got refugees. Which used to be just a few percent. It's increased now recently because there have been restrictions on study and work migration. So if you sort of look over a long period of time, actually it's family that tends to be the biggest contributor to the long-term growth in the migrant population, and that's either family of British citizens or family of other people who came on work or study visas.
And as you say, quite a disconnect between what the data is showing about the type of immigrants and the type of movement that's happening and what takes up political oxygen. So it may well be students who are the biggest proportion of immigrants coming to Britain, but that's a lot of the political oxygen at the moment is taken up with discussing small boat crossings and things like that. And I suppose if we could just get into that a bit of the contemporary environment, and I think it speaks to just the contortions and the contradictions and the language of politics that has kind of haunted this debate. Brexit, for example, was something that, whether or not you thought it was a good idea or a bad idea, it had as one of its kind of modus operandis, or one of the things that was promising, was maybe a change in immigration policy. However, ironically, what that did was reduce migration from the EU, but increased by a factor of 3 or 4 migration from other countries, particularly India and Nigeria. So I wonder if you could just talk to why politicians are tying themselves in knots, and the huge disconnect between what they're saying they're going to do, the effects of those policies, and then what actually happens. Yeah. Yeah,
I mean, the post-Brexit immigration system is a really good example of that gap between what politicians said would happen and what actually happened, because it was widely expected, including by me actually. I thought that net migration, which is the standard measure we use here, so kind of people coming in minus the number of people going out, I thought that it would decrease after Brexit, because so much of overall migration before Brexit came from European countries. And so what happened was kind of interesting, which was that effectively the government said, okay, well, we're going to have this big restriction, we're going to end free movement, and migration is going to go down a lot. So actually we have a little space to be a bit more liberal on the non-EU side. And this is where in the Vote Leave campaign you had people like Priti Patel saying, vote Brexit to save the curry houses, right? There was this kind of argument that we're going to be a bit more liberal towards non-EU citizens who might want to migrate to the UK. And some people chuckled at that time and said, they're not actually going to do that. And they did. And they did it much more than even they expected. And so I think the challenge here, and why we ended up with this really counterintuitive result, is that basically there's this kind of tension in public opinion. So if you poll people, members of the public, you say, do you want immigration to be higher or lower? then the most popular answer is usually lower. But then if you ask about specific groups of people, say, okay, well, how about, do you like care workers coming? What about doctors? Are you happy for British citizens to be able to marry a foreigner and bring them to the country? They'll say, yeah. No, we can be liberal on all of those things. And the challenge, basically, you've got this tension, which is what the public wants is liberal policies that deliver low levels of immigration. And that's not going to happen. Right? And so then the job of the government is to kind of try and reconcile those things and say, well, how do we control or reduce migration while also, where are we going to say no? And in the post-Brexit immigration system, they never really did that. And so they had the rhetoric of we're going to reduce migration, but actually the policy choices were very liberal in many cases. And plus, I think some of it was by design. Some of it was also just by accident, that they didn't realize. It's very difficult to predict. If you introduce a policy and say, okay, care workers can come to the UK, which is something that was done in 2022, it's really difficult to know how many people will take that up. So in the case of care workers, there were some internal government projections suggesting maybe in the low tens of thousands would be the number of people who would come. The actual number, if you include care workers and family members that they brought with them, was over 300,000. And that was just a surprise. And anyway, so it was a combination of sort of accident and by design, but it's just I think it illustrates really nicely why it's so hard to come up with a single decision that everyone is happy with.
And care workers in particular, I think, are a really interesting example of how nuanced and complicated are the metrics by which you want to talk about immigration. So on one hand, you could say care workers, they're not particularly high earning most of the time. Therefore, they may not be paying a huge amount into the budget, in taxation, and they might end up, therefore, having a kind of deficit relationship with the amount that they contribute into the British state. So if you do it from a purely economic angle, you might end up with that position. But then if you go, well, care workers are some of the most vital, important jobs that we have. Yes, and people have a huge emotional connection and a value to social care and a moral value as well. Then there's a different thing at play. So it kind of just one example really speaks to the complexity of what lens you want to view. I don't know, and it's interesting. How do you resist? Because my urge with this, and maybe this just speaks to the person I am, I don't know, is to moralize about it. It's to come to a humanitarian argument where I say, well, I actually have a kind of instinctive feeling that migration is probably a good thing, and there's reasons I could probably give for that. But how do you resist? How do you focus on the data and not get sucked into that kind of moralizing? Or do you feel that you can actually have a moral position on it? So I don't want to get you to ask a political question, but what's the... How do you take a position on it?
I don't take moral positions on anything. I think.
But you're fun at parties then.
No, so my job is basically just to explain this, and this is what the impacts are going to be. And some people might look at it and say that's morally reprehensible, and some people might look at it. And so I think often people think that those arguments speak for themselves, but then they would be really surprised to discover that someone looks at exactly the same situation and says no. And so actually in the care worker case, there's a different moral argument, right? Which is, okay, we live in a country where care workers are paid really badly, and these are incredibly valuable jobs. And we give people these really precarious conditions, we barely pay them anything, and then because no one wants to do it as a result of that, we bring in a load of migrant workers who don't have as many options and exploit them instead. And so actually the solution is just to sort out the care sector, pay people a decent wage, and you won't need as many people coming in. So there's always, there are always competing moral arguments on the same issue.
Absolutely, yeah, and all the political contortions as well that can lead to. It's a very incendiary topic at the moment. We've just had this Unite the Kingdom march in London yesterday. Part of that is backed by Reform, backed by the right-wing parties, and they seem to be obsessed with this idea of small boats. Why do you think that's so lodged in the public imagination? That's maybe an unfair question with long historic roots about Britain and how it thinks about boats. But why? What do you think could realistically change about that policy? Why do you think it's so inflammatory? And what can governments do? Why is that so tricky?
Yeah.
Why is that in the headlines so much?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's controversial partly because it's so visible. And I think people quite reasonably don't understand why it has been so impossible for the government to stop this arrivals of people happening in plain sight. There are other forms of people entering without permission where it's not very visible. So some people kind of in the nerdy immigration policy world that I live in, that will cheekily suggest actually the solution to this is quietly put everyone in lorries where they can't be photographed, right?
So it's an optics.
So the part of it is because it's so visible. So a lot of people actually who come to the UK, who are here illegally, have overstayed visas, and that's way less controversial, right? Someone comes in on a visitor visa and a student visa, and then they stay over. They're in a similar position of not having authorization, but it's much less toxic than small boats. So some of it is that, but I think in terms of the solutions, I think the real challenge here is that, yeah, there are things that would stop the boats. The problem is that France has to do them, and France doesn't want to do them, right? And so there are basically the two things that would have a really big impact are intercepting boats as they, in shallow waters on the French coastline, and France taking back almost everyone who came to the UK. And those things basically could happen. They're very, they're controversial, there are trade-offs. I'm not saying that they're sort of wonderfully easy, but they could happen. But basically the UK can't persuade, would love to persuade France to do those things, and it can't.
And is that because of a changed relationship post-EU, or is that just, would that exist anyway?
EU exit is kind of relevant here in that when we were in the EU, there was in theory an agreement where if someone had passed through other EU countries, they could be returned. So the UK could return people, and in return, the UK would accept people who had, say, who'd arrived in Italy but had family ties here. The challenge is that arrangement never really worked, and actually, even though the vast majority of people were crossing through Europe, I mean, obviously 100% of the people are arriving on small boats. The bureaucracy around it, and it just became very difficult in practice, to prove, okay, well, this person should be taken by France, this person should be taken by Italy or Greece or what have you. Anyway, so it was an arrangement that didn't really work in practice. So I think it's not necessarily because of Brexit. I think if we were in the EU, I doubt that France would just have said, okay, we'll deal with this completely differently. They would have done what they were required to do under EU law, which is not as much as the UK would like.
I think that question about optics is really interesting, and I suppose it's a different question about imagery in British political language. But I kind of want to zoom out a little bit and just compare Britain to the rest of the world. Am I right in thinking that most people seeking asylum do it in a neighbouring country, like the countries that take the most, for example, Iraq or Syria would be Turkey, or countries that are adjacent to war zones? So what's the international picture like? How does Britain sit with other countries of comparable size, what Mark Carney might now call medium economies?
Yeah.
And how does it sit with other countries that are, closer to conflicts and closer to people with a more urgent reason to flee or seek asylum?
So on refugees in particular, you're completely right. Most of the conflicts, obviously, Ukraine is slightly different. Most of the conflicts around the world are not happening anywhere close to the UK. And so people are displaced. They're often displaced within their own country. They might move within the country, or they move to the neighbouring country. And so it's the countries that are sort of in the regions that host the largest number of refugees. You've got places like Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, major refugee receiving countries. What then happens is that in those countries of what we call countries of first asylum, life is often not very good for refugees. They may not have a lot of rights. They may not be able, sometimes they can't work, or if they can work, it's very difficult for them to make a living. And so after a certain amount of time, if it becomes clear they're not going to be able to go back home, or these conflicts drag on for years or sometimes decades, people will often move on. And so what you have in a way is sort of refugees. They're still refugees under international law, but they're also turning into economic migrants in some sense, right? Because the initial move is for immediate safety, but then after that, people are moving in order to be able to build a life somewhere else. And economics, going to a wealthy country like the UK is part of that. The UK obviously there are lots of other high-income countries on the way. So most people who make it to Europe don't get to the UK either. The UK receives. Fluctuates, but maybe somewhere in the order of about 10% of the people who claim asylum in the EU would be claiming in the UK.
And where does Britain sit then internationally? Do you think, does it have a high level of immigration? Is it, where does it sit kind of geopolitically in comparison to other places?
It depends what kind of immigration you're talking about. Generally, I mean, if you look at refugees in particular, as a share of the population, we're not that different from Europe. One thing that's changed is that we have become more similar to Europe than we were in the past, right? Back when, a decade ago, people thought that the Channel was this impassable barrier. And then they realised it wasn't. And so actually the UK is more similar now to some of the big countries. If you look at a number of refugees that come to the UK per, compared to the size of our population, it's sort of broadly similar to some of the other big European countries where it used to be much lower. In other forms of immigration, actually similarly, I would say one thing that's specific about the UK is we speak English here. That's very attractive. A lot of people around the world speak English. So the UK is one of the most attractive destinations globally. But in other forms of migration, so we have more restrictive, as a result, I think we have more restrictive policies than a lot of other high-income countries, because if we had the same policies, many more people would take them up.
Great. Okay, we'll go to audience questions very shortly, so I'm just going to let them percolate if you have any. But just one final question is, what's the thing that you think is most counterintuitive or surprising when you talk to people about this? What's the fact that for you is like the most surprising or interesting? Or
from in terms of what people's views on migration.
What people's views are, or in terms of what you think is kind of a counterintuitive point about immigration that I suppose people get wrong. Like what are people? What's the thing that people are getting wrong?
I think, and I find this completely understandable, but I think it's really interesting that people struggle to differentiate between the kind of economics of migration, like what is actually economically beneficial for a country like the UK, and the moral arguments about who is a sort of morally virtuous person. And so I think people often assume that if someone's a nice person and a deserving, sort of, in some sort of broad social or humanitarian way, then they're also going to be good for the economy, and that's just not true. And so, there are some interesting. There was a survey experiment that someone did where they talk about a kind of hypothetical Nigerian building contractor and say, do you think this person is will bring economic benefits to the UK? But half the people just get told about the building contractor and what he's doing, and half the people get exactly the same thing, but they're told that he is enthusiastically applying for British citizenship. And which doesn't make any difference to the economic impacts. And people think that the guy is having a more positive economic impact if he's applying for citizenship, because it's so hard psychologically to disentangle this thing about who is sort of, seems like a nice chap and who is actually beneficial for the economy.
That's so interesting, and I think I've been experiencing it in our conversation and touching on. There's such a psychological, moral element that it's really hard to not get really stuck into that and have things conflated. So thank you so much.